I love getting to sit and talk about current issues and apologetics, which is defending the Bible. And this is probably the toughest topic as far as what we're facing as a church in the culture, sexuality and gender, for a couple of reasons. Not only because historically, when someone has stood up for or supported biblically or orthodox positions, such as sexuality, someone would disagree and say you're wrong. But now in the culture, it's not just that. It's saying those who hold those beliefs are evil. And now getting to the point where those who hold those beliefs should not be able to share those beliefs in the public square. So the idea of sexuality and gender is a very, very critical topic for the church. And I think it's really important for us to understand why we are where we are as a faith as far as sexuality, also how to explain it and defend it, and how to engage, and that's a critical part. And I love this quote that, hold on one second, this is from Christopher West, Our Bodies Tell God's Story. He said, "Remember, the devil doesn't have his own clay. All he can do is take God's clay and twist it, distort it, and mock it." And that's that whole idea of sin being broken goodness. And especially when it comes to sex, and we can see that is certainly the case. West calls Satan the great plagiarizer, and certainly when it comes to sex, it's that way. And it's often the case that it's only those who are lost who are then, when they come to Christ and look back, see how that deception worked and see how it was deception in their lives. And certainly that's the case of Christopher Yuan. Christopher Yuan, in 1993, told his parents he was gay, and they immediately rejected him. Later, both parents came to Christ, and she confided to him that although she did not support his position, she said she knew she could do nothing but love her gay son as God loved her. He was fully engaged in the new lifestyle. It led to promiscuity, it led to drugs. He ended up being expelled from his dentistry school in Louisville, moved to Atlanta, then began supplying drug dealers with drugs, got busted. During this time, his parents had come to Christ. And as he wrote, his parents knew my biggest sin wasn't same-sex sexual behavior. My biggest sin was unbelief. And they continued to pray for him. And he tells the story about him being in a jail, now HIV positive, and looking up and seeing a sign about reading Jeremiah 29:11, and about this good news, this idea that there is something beyond who he was. And it got him to read the Bible more. And the more he read, the more he realized how critical it wasn't who he was sexually, it was who he was in Christ if he was going to come that way. He said, "My identity is not gay, ex-gay, or even straight. My true identity is in Jesus Christ alone." And Christopher Yuan is now, with his PhD, teaches at Moody Bible College. He talks about what we'll discuss at the end, his idea of holy sexuality. And that's the book he wrote, this idea of holy sexuality and what it means. And it's critical that we look at what sexuality is, not just from the Bible, and we'll talk a bit about that, but also what it isn't. And that's the key part that we're going to look at in how we react to the culture. I told one of my relatives yesterday the title of my talk, Knowing What You Believe, Biblically Engaging a Hypersexualized Culture. And he wrote back and said, "Yeah, Christians are obsessed over that sex thing." And I wrote back, I said, "Correction, God is obsessed about sex. And one of the things that is critical that we realize is that sexuality is a big deal to God. It's one of these big themes that carries throughout the Bible. It's one of the big things that he cares about because it relates so much to his creation and what it means. And no mistake about it, we are facing a wave. In fact, the latest study from Gallup shows that U.S. adults self-identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or something other than heterosexual has more than doubled to over 7%. And among those in the Generation Z, they were born between 1997 and 2003, it's more than 1 in 5 now identifying as LGBT. Now the key thing there is identifying, and we'll talk a bit about that, because that's a key part of what identification is and what it means. Christopher West, who I mentioned before, this is a key part when we talk about, as my relative said, you Christians are all hung up there about sex and morality and that sort of thing. As West says, God didn't come to repress our desires, he came to redeem our desires, heal, and perfect toward his love. Perfect toward his love. And so the first thought is, well, what does the human body and sex have to do with the basic tenets of the Christian faith? And of course, we can go and and I mentioned in there just a couple of parts in the Bible, really starting at the very beginning, as we know well, 1:27 Genesis, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That idea of creation, and when you see a word repeated 3 times in one verse, that means it's important, real important. So that idea of creation, how critical that was. It's interesting when we look and that idea of what it means to the church, sexuality, and the images in the Bible. Ephesians 5:31-32, let all bitterness and wrath and anger, for the reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. It's interesting that connection between sexuality, a husband and a wife, in the church. And then, of course, in Revelation 21:1-2, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride, adorned for her husband. That visualization of what that means, and it reinforces that idea of that great anticipation when we will be united with the bridegroom. And so it really impacts an understanding sexuality from the biblical perspective. God, Christ, and the church. West, again, as he says, when we get the body and sex wrong, we get the divine story wrong as well. In short, as sex goes, so goes marriage. As marriage goes, so goes the family. And because the family is the fundamental cell of society, as the family goes, so goes the culture. So this idea of, it is real important to God. It's not something we're hung up because we want people to have fun. Sexuality is great, and sexuality is celebrated within the proper framework because of what it does and the goodness that it gives to his created. And there are really 2 fronts when we're engaging culture. Christians who say the Bible doesn't really condemn sexual activity outside of marriage. And then those who say, they don't believe in the Bible, so what's it matter? But we'll see that anything impacts the family, impacts culture, and we'll be talking about that.
What were the last 2 words of that sentence, Steve West quote? When we get body and sex wrong, we get something.
Yes. When we get body and sex wrong, we get the divine story wrong as well. The divine story. That idea of this picture, this story. So I want to bring up here a couple of objections you've probably read or heard or even seen about the orthodox, the biblical perspective on sexuality, especially from the Christian worldview. And remember that worldview being that lens through which we look at everything in life. And we all have a worldview, just like everybody has morals, depends what it's based on. And for the Christian, the Bible-inspired faith should impact how we look at all issues. For example, that whole idea that we are all made in the image of God, created. Well, that has to impact how do we look at our fellow humans, all of them. All of them. That should impact and does impact the Christian worldview. So in the same way, what are objections to that? I don't know if any of you saw the progressive lawmaker who stood up in Congress a couple months ago and said, I'm now going to read everything that Jesus Christ said condemning homosexuality. And he stood there for 3 minutes. And in that sense, he's right. You don't see Christ saying that. But that's not the point. That's not the context. I think that's important because clearly it is spoken of in Leviticus about man and man being together. Paul in Romans speaks about the sin of homosexuality. In Hebrews, it reinforces the idea, Hebrews 13, of marriage between a man and a woman. So clearly within there's the context of what it is and what it is exclusively, and Christ speaks about in Matthew 19 about marriage being a man and a woman. So to say, well, he doesn't speak specifically about fill in the blank means he must be approving of it. You can go long down that path. So I think clearly in what we're talking about, it's clear that Christ, God, the idea is that it's not approving of sex outside monogamous heterosexual marriage. And I think that's a key point. Too often, people kind of do away with that premarital sex or the affair sex is, well, it may not be good, but it's not as bad as. Well, no, it is as bad as. They are all sexual sin is sexual sin outside, and I think that's important to remember. As well as it's important to remember the blood of Christ that comes shed for us so that our sins are washed away. We repent, we return, and that's available to all. Objection 2 is that, well, yes, Paul condemns sexuality and homosexuality, and he does quite a bit in his writing, but he was talking about sex in the temples, or he was talking about man-boy sex. That's what he was condemning. And there was no idea of a homosexual relationship in that biblical time, which is nonsense. The 5th century Plato wrote about it. Other Greek writers wrote about the fact that there were homosexuals engaging in that sex. It is clear, and even scholars who are in favor of homosexual rights within the church acknowledge, no, Paul, we don't agree with him, we don't think it counts now, but Paul was certainly talking about any homosexual acts there. And then the third one, and this is especially within the Christian churches, especially the mainline churches, who have gone forward and sanctified homosexual marriage, is that, well, culture changes. In fact, you may remember the bishop, the Episcopal bishop, and this made the big news about 25 years ago, the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church. And that was his line. Things changed. Culture is different than 1,000 years ago, and we have to change with it. Two things I'd always thought, well, the whole idea of the Bible is a foundational plumb line of which we are to live. It's not changeable like the weather. But something struck me just a couple of months ago when I was thinking about this in general, cutting the lawn or something. And I said, wait a second. Christ is God, part of the Trinity, coming into our time and space from outside to come to us. To God, to Christ, to the Holy Spirit, there is no time. There is no space. I've heard the expression, 1,000 years is like a second's like 1,000 years. So are you saying, Christian bishop who've been to seminary, that this God who breaks in, he didn't know 2,000 years from now there's going to be a push for legalizing homosexual marriage. So it's counter to the belief that, of course, to God, everything. There is no time constraints. He knows all. So 3 objections, just thoughts. And later on, I want to talk just a couple questions that we can ask. But those are questions that will be asked that we can have answers to. I think it's important before we get to that to kind of look and say, how did we get here? If you think about it, especially just in the last generation, in the last decade, how did we get here? Victor Hugo, a writer from the 19th century, an invasion of armies can be resisted, but not an invasion of ideas. And that's where we are. We have had an invasion of ideas. So it's amazing. If you think about Western civilization, for 1,500 plus years, agreed with the biblical interpretation of sexuality. It's not that sexual sin didn't happen. That's not the point. But the structure of civilization agreed with some basics. That is, the only recognized marriage was heterosexual marriage, discouraged divorce, exceptions, but really discouraged it for centuries, even criminalizing homosexuality and sex outside the marriage in some cultures, and never questioning what a man and a woman was. It was just basic stuff. So these are foundational for centuries and centuries and centuries. And now, within the last generation, all this gets turned on its head. So it's really happened rapidly. And for many of us here, the thought is, well, what do we blame? What decade do we blame? The 60s, the sexual revolution. And certainly that was a time when those shackles were thrown off the public sphere, but the root and the rot started a couple hundred years before. In the 1700s, in the Enlightenment period, in Western civilization. Because this is also the same time the Bible started losing its influence in culture. Are the two related? Not a coincidence. So that's really when all this started. And you don't like to just blame one person, but this guy, we're going to put a lot for starting it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher, a bon vivant. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. That's yes, we're born, but we're all restricted. We got to change that. And that was his philosophy. And he was really the poster boy of this, overthrowing these shackles. A lot of his philosophy encouraged and was part of the French Revolution, getting rid of the church there. And so man could truly be free. And here's the key difference between Rousseau's worldview and the Christian worldview. His view was, and this Enlightenment thinking, man and woman basically are born good. And then society messes them up. All these restrictions, that messes them up. Of course, the Christian worldview, we're all born, what? In sin. And it's the blood of Christ that can lift us up. That's a real difference if you think about it. So if all these little babies are born good, but then they end up doing bad things, so whose fault is it, right? So then we look around to change those things that are fault. And really, the paths will lead to very different places. And this worldview really went through the West. And it wasn't just Rousseau, and it moved forward. And we've got this idea of Darwin, he's on the upper left. That was a big boost now in the middle of the 1800s. So now you're taking creation away from God and saying it all just happened. Okay, so now you're taking that away, and then on the left, anybody know who that is? Sigmund Freud, yes, the father of psychoanalysis in the late 19th century into the 20th century. He's the first one, and especially sexuality was part of his, he was the first one to coin homosexuality and heterosexuality, those terms. Because before this, it wasn't that men weren't having sex with men and women weren't having sex with women. That was going on, as we know, read the Bible, for a long time. That was behavior. It wasn't who the people were. So by labeling them, in his idea, these were the terms. So now we're putting people in those categories. And then, of course, his idea of the sexual desire and fulfillment were the key to human existence. That was the core, and the Freudian look at. And he rejected those, what he called moral barriers to sexuality. So again, remember, all those chains that are on us, we're free, but we're not free because we've got these barriers that people are keeping us from being who we are. So those are all setting up. Philip Rieff, who a generation ago, late philosopher, he said, cultures are primarily defined by what they prohibit. That was interesting. I'd not thought of that. And then you think through, well, yeah. Because in our state, what do we want to do? We kind of want to do what we want to do, but we're told no, because we want an order in our culture, there are restrictions. Restrictions how fast you drive, and all those sorts of things. Those kind of laws there to go away from that natural inclination. And we see what happens in nations in which the government falls apart because of civil war. What happens? Anarchy, right? And who rules? The one with the biggest gun. I mean, so we see it in little and big examples of it without having that. And so what you have is when you reject this idea of having these prohibitions because they're keeping me from what I really want to do, you're going to have a culture that is changing rapidly. And because the natural inclination in our fallen state is we want to do what we want to do. But we have these prohibitions that keep us lined up. We have within our belief systems that keep us together because we know what is best for us and what is best for the culture. But what we end up having now, and it has rapidly taken form in our culture, is what Carl Trueman, who wrote a terrific book, and it's on the list there of the bibliography, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is it? And he uses, talking about Rieff and also Charles Taylor, this term expressive individualism. Expressive individualism. And this is where we are now. This is what has led to. We find our meaning by giving expression to our own feelings and desires. So that's where the meaning comes from. And oppression is anything that keeps me from expressing my true inner self. So anything that's restricting this. So can you see the line from Rousseau's idea of what's making us bad and what we need to get rid of those shackles to where we are now with this expressive individualism? And so who is now not keeping those restrictions? If you're not believing in the restrictions of the Bible about sexuality or reinterpreting them, then you can end up going wherever you want to go as far as sexuality and gender. And so it's going on to this unbelievable pace. Trueman concludes about Rousseau's impact on culture. Many of his ideas have become the commonplace assumptions of the Western culture. His focus, society and culture, is the problem, not the individuals. And by the way, Rousseau fathered 5 illegitimate children, all of whom he sent to the orphanage, which in 18th century France meant you died or you were sent to the streets to be a beggar. But he got rid of 5 inconveniences. We do it a little more quietly now, don't we? Getting rid of those inconveniences. Well, I thought that was always interesting when you look at, this is what I want to be free, but didn't think of 5 children who died quite young. Aldous Huxley, you love it when at least they're honest with quotes. We objected to morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. He was a writer and philosopher that kind of says it all. This is why we don't like it, because this is what it keeps us from doing. And so much is focused on the identity. And this is where we're coming to now in the culture, this idea of sexuality not being behavior, but being identity. And this is the key element that is the biggest challenge for those holding the orthodox views on sexuality in the culture. Matthew Vines is a gay activist, Christian, who wrote God and the Gay Christian, the Biblical Case in Support of Same-Sex Relationships. So again, we talked about within the church this idea that what God said isn't really against homosexuality now. One of his biggest issues is it's not fair. If I'm not attracted to a woman, that means I can't get married, so I want to be married, so I should be able to marry a man. And it comes to, he calls it, our sexuality, as he said, is a core part of who we are. And that's Freud, right? And that's that whole expressive individualism. That is who I am. And this is that distorted picture of personhood. Because remember, we came from who I am, made in the image of God, created by God, to how I am, how I behave, as far as that's my identity. And so you've taken your identity from who you are to what you do. And that's the critical thing that has turned, and it ends up being even taken into those who support the idea of sexuality by saying, well, I am heterosexual. Well, that's part of the ID. Your behavior is heterosexual, but you are made in the image of God. That's who we are. And that, if we keep looking at, is critical for how we engage. Is who you are what you do, or who you are who you were created by and what we are created for and for our purpose. Well, we heard the term a lot, follow the science. And I love the term follow the science. It's usually used against conservatives, especially Christians, knuckleheads, who don't believe in science. Science, of course, we talked about this when I did the worldview. The greatest scientists in the Western time were Christians who wanted to know more about this creation from God. So the idea that we are anti-science is crazy. So let's follow the science, shall we? And see what is best for God's creation, which means for our culture, which means let's look at America. What's best for it? So let's follow the science and see what the impact is when we don't follow God's prescription for sexuality and what is best for the family. And some facts. So in 1960, 90% of kids lived with a married mom and dad. 1960. And that dropped down to 64%. Okay. Over the same period, the percent of kids born to unmarried women rose from 5% to 41%. All right. Those are just facts. Those are facts. So then you look at and say, when we're not raising children in this environment that God prescribes, what happens? Ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. John Stonestreet from the Colson Center uses that term. And here are just some fatherless stats in America. 5 times teen suicide, 7 times teen pregnancy, those who are raised without children before they're 18, anytime. High school dropout 9 times, chemical abuse center admissions 10 times, youth prison 20 times, homeless and runaway 32 times. Versus children in a home with a married mom and dad. So just looking at the stats, saying again, the idea of God making rules and restrictions because He wants what's best for us. It's not to keep us from having fun. And this is an example when that doesn't happen. That's sexuality, and part of that now has gone to gender. I mean, it's off the rails in gender. And It started with, when we look at the Yogyakarta in 2006. I didn't know they had this meeting till I looked, but they had a meeting in Indonesia and decided they were going to make some rules about gender. And again, this is coming, a lot of this started in the academia and then is flowing through. So, sexual orientation, a person's emotional, affectional, and sexual attraction to individuals of different gender, same gender, or more than one gender. So that's sexual orientation. Gender identity is a deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with sex assigned at birth. So have you heard that term, sex being assigned? This is where it came from, 16 years ago. So, do we see the feelings ruling things? So this is the principles, and again, when we talk about what's in the water, what's in the air, what's in the culture, this is a direct response and to this feeling of shackles, and it's the direct foundation for this new look at what's going on. So again, let's follow the science. I loved following the science, right? So let's follow the science. Are men and women distinct? According to this, no. Right? Gender identity is not, but wait, let's follow the science. So, and I'm not a biologist, but I looked it up and I know about chromosomes, and chromosomes carry the genetic information in our cells. And there are 23 pairs in humans, man and female. 22 are the same, exactly. And then there's one pair that's different. And so female have two X's, and we guys have an X and a Y. Ta-da! One becomes a male, one becomes a female. That's it. That's scientific. It's always been. But when you embrace expressive individualism, that goes out the door. So now we're up to, and you may have a newer number, I'm up to 63 genders have been identified. So again, there's probably more, because it's been a little while since I looked at that. So we don't fool with silly little things like chromosomes. So this idea of, again, how do you get here? Well, this is how we get here, through the idea of that expressive individualism. And as Carl Trueman says, expressive individual detaches ideas of individual and dignity from any grounded in the sacred order, which is what we reinforce. All we have is a morass of competing tastes. Kind of says it all. Morass of competing tastes. And unfortunately, that has hit the church. When asked by Barna, any sexual expression between consenting adults, is it acceptable? 69% of Americans say yes, 40% practicing Christians, that is regular attending. So you see how this gets in the culture, in the water. And as Trueman says, when the sacred order collapses, morality is simply a matter of taste, not truth. So this idea of morality, what are you basing it on? We look at, again, is it right to push an old lady in front of a bus? We'll all agree no. Why not? All right. What are you basing your opinion on? So this idea of what is your morality based on? Is it a sacred order? So God's instructions are what he creates flourishes when he sets out and we follow these outlines. When we defy them, we have the victims. And so here's some questions. Some questions to think about, and maybe if you're chatting with someone, just to throw out as an idea. Again, an engagement, not an interrogation, an engagement with somebody. So, question one, when you're talking about sexuality, where do you stop? In other words, is it all right for an adult to have sex with a 6-year-old boy? I'll probably say no. Well, what about 3 men and a 14-year-old girl? Well, no. Why not? Well, the law says that. So, what's the difference? And by the way, that's the last taboo that's dropping, is pedophilia. I mean, why will it not drop, right? So in other words, you're taking and saying, well, what about sex with animals? Is that okay? What about many wives or many husbands? In other words, okay, you don't like these restrictions, which are restrictive. You want to make this exception. Well, what about all the other exceptions? So just a question as you chat and as you look at what's going on. And so also, if you're talking about somebody who rejects the idea of a Bible, I don't believe in the Bible, I don't think, don't put your morality on me, right? You've heard that. Don't express your morality on me. You, by the way, are putting your morality on me, but that's another issue. But another question, another set of questions, just to think about, a thought experiment, I call it. So let's just just pretend, since the beginning of time, the only sex was monogamous, heterosexual, married couples, okay? Would there be any sexual transmitted diseases? Some science guys said, there might be a few getting in there, but anyway, the point is made. How could you not? All right? Would there be a lot fewer abortions? If all children were brought up by a married mother and father, would the child poverty rate be a fraction of what it is now? Right? If there were another thought experiments, only homosexual sex, starting today, that's the only sex, homosexual sex. How many people will be on Earth in 2130? So the point is kind of saying, just pulling out, saying, is there a reason for these restrictions that we're talking? Is there a biblical reason? Is there a reason for the culture and for the good of the culture? And they all point to this idea, such as talking about kids and sex. I mean, that's a very well, it's all part of that moral order, and that moral order for what is best for the culture and those choices. And what was once considered unthinkable is now celebrated. You think about that. I mean, you don't have to be very old here to look back not very many years and see what's going on. And here we really have, and this is the most striking part as I did research and was updating, because I've done this chat in the past, when I came across this information from J.D. Unwin. The whole of human history does not contain a single instance of a group becoming civilized unless it has absolutely been monogamous. Okay, who is this? Some crazy Christian guy? He is a non-Christian. He wrote his book in 1939. He was a non-Christian sociologist, philosopher, and he did a book, Sex and Culture. This is 1939. He looked back at 80 tribes and 6 historical civilizations over 5,000 years. Okay, 1939, looking back, 5,000 years. So tribes, 6. Through the lens of a single question, does a culture's ideas of sexual liberation predict its success or collapse? That's pretty amazing back in 1939. Again, things were already changing. It was more hidden. But here's one, and he wanted to do it. And again, remember, he's not a Christian. In fact, he said, I make no opinion about rightness and wrongness. He was just a scientist. He wanted to know. Here's the pattern behind unraveling societies. If 3 consecutive generations abandoned sexual restraint built around the protections of marriage and fidelity, they collapsed. 3 consecutive generations abandoned sexual restraint built around protections of marriage and fidelity, they collapse. When a culture fails to restrain its sexual instincts, people think less of securing the future and instead compromise the stability, productivity, and well-being of the next generation in the pursuit of sexual pleasure. Give me what I want today. 1939. So think about it as we look at culture. 3 generations of this idea of that restraints.
Well, that quote you did about the 60s, the early 60s, the stats, and that's, would you say we're about one generation?
Yeah, I'd say we're kind of in the middle of, I mean, we're all doing those crazy things, but now it's getting into the idea of legally taking the restraints away. I'd say we're kind of in the middle of it, and it's blowing and going harder. So, and 3 generations is a long time. It's 100 years, you know.
The decay kind of exponentially decays, you know.
Yes, right. And the more it gains steam, the harder it is to make any change. And part of it, you may be thinking this is fine, but are biblical facts or these facts are going to change any people's minds? And of course, we know the Holy Spirit does the conversion. We can be used by it, that's for sure. But as we've seen, the culture, the Western culture, American culture, is so sex saturated. It's going to be very difficult. Another, within the church, just an idea, the latest Pew survey, 1/3 of weekly churchgoers approve of homosexual marriage. So within the United States and also within the church, it's changing. So there's going to be a more anti-biblical worldview, and as with any big cultural issue, like abortion or anything else, as Christ did, it'll be standing firm, but it's also how we engage to change. Because it's really critical that we remember this idea that we are engaging with fellow image bearers of God. And that's sometimes we forget about that. We end up being just like another political fight party, right? And we can't do that. This is a bigger time than ever for the church to stand out that way. And when we look at, okay, how does it work? And Christopher Yuan, we talked about, I think an easy and even more powerful story, just because it talks to what the church did, is Rosaria Butterfield. Anybody heard of Rosaria Butterfield? She was a professor of English and women's studies at my alma mater, Syracuse University, and a lesbian, very liberal, and she encountered some Christian students up there. She said they seemed to believe knowing Jesus meant knowing little else. That was her opinion of this. And this is in the 90s, mid-90s. And so we're seeing the moral majority, we're seeing has grown into a little bit of a more political force. Also, this is the time of Promise Keepers. Remember Promise Keepers? And Promise Keepers was a Christian organization, and the whole idea was helping men act like men as far as being fathers and husbands. I mean, that was the center of it. And boy, a lot of the feminists thought it was off base. And she wrote an article about it, and attacking Christianity. And she wrote it in the paper there, and she would keep a box on her desk, two boxes, one for the hate mail and the other for the fan mail. And it was coming in. And then this letter came from a Presbyterian pastor. As she said, it defied the filing system. She put it in the middle for a little bit. And he wrote, again, clearly said he is a pastor. He was asking, as she said, it was kind and inquiring. How did you come to your conclusions? Are you sure your ideas are right? So it got her thinking. She crumpled it up, threw it away, and then that night got it out of the garbage and read it again. And the bottom was, this pastor and his wife invited her to come to dinner. And she said, look, I'm doing research. Yeah, I'll do a dinner. And she did. And they started meeting regularly. And not only that, they would go with her to meet with her friends, which were mostly homosexual, some transgender even. And they met regularly. And one of the things that stood out, he would ask grace before they eat. And she was struck by the power of his prayer. It wasn't perfunctory. She was struck too by the times he would apologize for when he had overstepped. There's just something about this pastor. And she started to, as she said, devour the Bible. She's a researcher, did that anyway. And she talks about being at a party with her friends and going up to one person in particular and saying, because they were saying something different about you. And she said, I'm reading the Bible, and what if it's true? What if it's true? And then she visited the church. This is now a couple of years on. She said her butch haircut and all. Visited the church, and several years later gave herself to Christ. And she recounts here how the church embraced her.
When I became a Christian, I was also still very deeply rooted in the lesbian community. I had just broken up with my lover, but my heart was not in it at all. I was the faculty advisor to, 4 or 5 student LGBT groups on campus. Like most research professors, I had lectures to give and classes to teach in queer theory. And quite frankly, when I first became a Christian, I was terrified because I fully expected the elders of my church to be standing in the back of my 300-person feminist theory class, with placards like the kind I used to see at gay pride marches. And I was really terrified about this. And what I was really surprised by about Christians was that they gave me the grace to work out my relationships. And they understood that I was not a blank slate and that this wasn't going to get all cleaned up in a day. My pastor and my elders and their wives and my friends in the church treated me like a person who was working, but was not going to get all cleaned up at once. And the other thing that really amazed me about Christians was that they were almost, they were so sensitive to the fact that I had lost something that I valued. Nobody said to me, well, Rosaria, that was sinful. Let's move on. Nobody said that at all. I mean, people knew that it was a sinful relationship, but my ex-lover was an image bearer of a holy God, and she did amazing things in the world. And I was really going to not only miss her, but miss the house that we had together, miss our dogs and our dishes and the view of the lake from the window. I lost a lot, and I was amazed that my Christian friends knew that they grieved with me. I was also amazed at how kind these Christians were to the people I had left behind. I was amazed that they understood that they lost more even than I did, because they didn't have union with Christ. They didn't have the hope of the gospel. All they had was this woman who had been an activist and a friend and a trustworthy person who became a betrayer and a danger. And they were really sensitive to what their needs were and what their problems were. And then finally, I was really amazed at the way that Christians were not only just having me in their home because it was Sunday afternoon, but the regular way that people's homes were open and the things that people were telling me that they were, strangely enough, learning from me. I was amazed that people allowed me to take my place as an image bearer of a holy God and as a newly crafted woman of God, and to be a helper. I mean, they were small things and they were big things, but I was allowed to bake bread for my pastor's wife. I was involved and embraced, and that was really powerful. But mostly what amazed me was nobody said, wow, now that you're a Christian, I hope we can just be done with all this lesbian stuff and we can just get on with the business of getting you married off and getting you all cleaned up and getting you, safely packaged in a way that we can recognize. No, that was not what my church did. My church was willing to meet me right where I was at and nurture me and love me in the Lord from there. And I learned that the biggest sin in my life was unbelief, not homosexuality. I learned that the blood of Jesus covered the sin not only of my enormous legacy of sexual lust and other things, but also my tepid relationship to the Bible. And I just fell in love more and more with Jesus and with his church because of the way that Christians could stand with me and weep with me and walk with me and not think that suddenly I was going to be all cleaned up. Because you know what? They weren't all cleaned up either.
Powerful that the last book on the bibliography is her story there. She is now married to a pastor, Presbyterian pastor, lives in North Carolina, and speaks and writes. But I just think that powerful story, it was years from that letter to her conversion and then moving forward. And what a powerful testimony she has, as does Christopher with others. So just a different perspective there. Yes, sir.
Christopher's mother made a prayer room in the closet in her house and fasted every Monday and prayed for him the entire time and said, whatever it takes, God,
Yeah.
whatever it takes, save Chris. And she made a list of writing, instead of somebody asking her, how's Chris? He said, well, he's in jail and I don't know, he's trying to investigate. She started making a list of the good things about him, right? Like, well, he was there a lot of weeks, so maybe one or two things a week. The good things about him. And there's a photograph of her holding the page, the top tape to the bottom, to the top to the bottom. She's standing on a chair when he got out, and she's holding it up over his head. It goes all the way and trails up to the
Wow, I did not know that. What a great story. Yeah, it's the power, and he talks about, and again, when that happened, his parents were not saved at all, and but they disowned him. But then coming to Christ, and they do powerful witness together. And again, he teaches all over from Moody and does sessions about that. This idea of sexuality and how it makes a difference, and that whole idea and that theme that keeps coming through, that blood of Christ, and that whole idea of it's not homosexuality, it was not having a relationship with Christ. I mean, that heart of it, and then what flows out of it, and the idea of the body of believers. And Truman, who I'd mentioned there, he has a couple of ideas when we come to engagement. This idea of playing the long game. In other words, it's not something that's going to change tomorrow. It didn't change, right? It took a couple hundred years to really pick up momentum. We're playing a long game, so that's especially related to how we teach our children and grandchildren for what we're talking about. And again, one thing that's Chuck Colson used to tell us, which is so cool, he'd say, look, we know how the story ends. Christ is coming back. He wins. It's this in-between stuff. So we are playing the long game there. Focus locally. We can get so engaged with this idea of all the noise from across the country, right? And all the we got a little town here with a lot of lost people. Let's do what we can in our circle. And I love that point that he gets to, the idea of remembering where we are and who we are serving in that. And then the idea Christopher talks about the engagement and how to engage. And remember, he's from this lifestyle to the others, as he brings out this idea of don't start with comparing same-sex relationship with other sins. And again, he's not saying it's not a sin, but remember, and this is key when you're speaking to somebody, either whether or not they're homosexual, if they believe in it's okay, for example, to have homosexual marriage, they believe that behavior is identity. And so if you're leading with this idea that it's sin, you're shutting it down, because you're shutting me down. So it's this idea of, wait a second, and he gets into this, tell me about you, rather than identity. Let me know more about you. And because, again, that behavior is the core of who they are. So we make sure we kind of go in that other direction. Don't say love the sinner, hate the sin. That's one of the big ones on there. And again, the same idea. It's coming from, well, wait a second. Those can't be separated. If you believe your behavior is who you are, you can't separate those things. You hate me because I don't think it's a sin. That whole, it's hard to get away from that life, which goes to the idea of, as Christopher says, just do it instead of say it. Just love them. just let you saying it. Just love them, but then get into that other conversation that way to know about them. And that's that idea again, because sex is the identity that is who they are. That's why that's so important. Also, not debating, getting to know, asking questions. That should be digging deeper. This idea, for example, and he uses the idea when you're challenged, well, you believe gay's a sin. That idea of, well, how do you define sin? In other words, that's a term, that's a churchy term that gets thrown back, but it's interesting to see, since you're using that term, what do you think sin is? Even the idea of what's it mean to be gay, that's one of those terms. It's kind of like when we're looking at any discussion, especially if it has a potential of being contentious when it comes to our faith, it's really important that we define the terms so that we're both talking about the same thing. I'll use when we're talking about justice, and there's no one bigger about justice than Jesus Christ, right? And so we hear a term like equity, which is one of these. What's it mean? Well, it means, forget what the dictionary says. To some people, it means equality, and to some other, equal opportunities. To other, it's equal outcome, and to others, it's political. So it's really key to say, let's make sure we know what we're talking about. And the same is when we're coming to sexuality. That might be, do you think, because someone's homosexual, they're going to hell? Well, what's your idea of hell? What's your idea of judgment? Is there judgment? And again, all coming back to, what did Paul say in Romans? All of us are sinners. All have fallen. And it keeps coming back to that heart, rather than of being superior in some way, saying we all are sinners, but we've been saved by Christ. And that idea of relationships being the key, how critical it is. And the idea of loving the Lord with all our heart and mind and strength, and living that way, and how critical that is to the people we're engaging with, especially at this time when things are so difficult for the church, and will be more so, because again, we've gone from where it's not just being disagreed with, it's saying we shouldn't even have that opinion, and we shouldn't even be able to share it or live it. And that's the kind of persecution that's going to come, and it will be, and there is no doubt. I've talked to people, I've been retired now almost 7 years in my business and in my company, and there's some strong believers there, and some are still there, and this idea that, gosh, I can't stand up now for some of these basic biblical beliefs, whether sexual or about abortion. I'll lose my head, and that's a sad thing, but it's a reality, and that's figuratively losing our head, but that's a reality. But what did Christ promise? That standing for him, it is going to be tougher. But I think it's critical that we understand where the others are coming from, so that we can engage and have those answers that make a difference. you mind if I pray? Let's bow. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for your Holy Spirit guiding us. We thank you for your word, that we have your word. We thank you for the blood of Christ that has washed us. We thank you for the opportunity to share you with those who are lost. Guide and strengthen us so that we may have an impact locally on those who are in such need. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. Any questions or thoughts on that sheet? There is a bibliography there with some terrific books. So it's a big topic. So, okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity. Appreciate it. Thank you.